Good evening, everybody. Welcome, friends. I'm Greg Youtz, music professor at Pacific Lutheran University and frequent host of Symphony Tacoma events. I'm delighted to be here this evening in this preview of our February 27 broadcast concert called That's a Wrap, in which we get to hear a horn quartet play music from a whole lot of eras, from the 19th century on through to the present day. Let me make sure to thank our sponsors. You know, Symphony Tacoma and all of its glorious musicians just could not keep going without the help of local and national sponsors. So let us take a moment to thank Multicare, Tacoma Creates, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Washington State Arts Commission, the League of American Orchestras, locally here in Tacoma, One Stop Dentistry, and Charles Wright Academy. Thank you all very much for your support for your Tacoma Symphony. Let me introduce at this point my two guests this evening, my two conversation partners. Daniel Partridge is the principal horn for Symphony Tacoma, and Sandon Lohr is the assistant principal horn. So let's introduce Dan and Sandon. Good evening, you two. It's nice to see you on camera. I wish we were in the Pantages, but this is the next best thing.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, as I say, this is a conversation about a concert that is coming up, a broadcast, a premiere broadcast that you participated in, coming up on February 27 at 7:30 p.m., broadcast on YouTube. And so we're here this evening to just chat, talk about the horn quartet, and of course, the pieces that you're going to play. I thought I would start off by just asking the two of you to talk about yourselves. How on earth did you discover the horn? Dan, let's start with you.
Well, I was in 5th grade, and my parents said, we'd like you to do band. I was taking piano lessons, and I said, I don't want to do band. I already play piano, and band is for geeks, and I'm not interested. And then they tried again when I was in 6th grade, and they said, well, you can play any instrument you want. And I was like, cello might be kind of cool, but it's really big. And the general music teacher, she'll kill me if I tell this, but she was very pretty. She was just out of college. And I was like, I guess if you could get me horn lessons with Miss Hurst, I'd take French horn lessons. And they did. And we lived right next to the school. So she'd walk down once a week and teach us lessons at my house. And my palms would get all sweaty. But I was really motivated to practice because I wanted to make a good impression. So, and she just retired, actually. So career as a music educator. And anyway, I wouldn't be here without her and my elementary school band director.
That's a wonderful story. Does she have any idea about that story?
I don't know. I don't know that I want her to. So.
Excellent. 6th grade boys in love. I remember it well. Sandon, how about you? How did you get interested in the horn?
Well, the way I got interested in the horn was, you go through, elementary school, and you have to take music classes. And I absolutely hated them. Every single one. It was a terrible thing. And when I got to the end of elementary school, I was like, I hate this. I never want to do music, ever. But I am originally from Pullman, Washington, the other side of the state. And my mother's a professor at Washington State University. And occasionally you get to have a sabbatical leave. And so she just decided, we're going to move to France, and we're going to live in France for a year. And so we went there. They put me into one of the French public schools. And, well, it was wonderful. So when I come back to school, entering the sixth grade back in the school, and, well, you're required to take 1 year of music. Well, back in 4th grade, I didn't join the orchestra with a string instrument then, because I hated it. Thought that would be more of it. So I said, you know what? I'll do the band, because there was lots of singing. I don't want to do singing in previous classes. And which instrument do you want to play? I want the one that's French. And they try to talk me out of it. They go, "Oh, it's not French. That's not what you're supposed to call it. It's supposed to be just the horn." No, I want it because it says it's French, but trumpets, that's actually a French design. Where the horns are German, you don't want that. No, I want it because it's called French. And turns out I actually liked it and haven't quit yet.
If you guys had gone to England, would you be playing the English horn now?
Actually, probably.
Those are both such wonderful, unique, unexpected stories. I mean, nobody would have guessed either of those stories.
Yeah, most people say, "Oh, I heard Star Wars, and I thought that was such a great instrument." My parents didn't let me watch Star Wars because it was rated PG.
Right. Well, I know that besides, of course, playing principal and assistant principal horn in Symphony Tacoma, you, like many musicians in the symphony, you have other things going on. So let's just chat a little bit about the rest of your life before we dive into the horn side. Daniel, what else do you have going on? I know you're down in Vancouver, Portland area.
That's right. I live in Vancouver. I am the horn teacher at Portland State University and also the principal horn of the Vancouver, Washington Symphony Orchestra. And if that weren't enough, I'm also the I'm the manager of music editorial at Oregon Catholic Press, which is a publishing company down in Portland. And we manufacture books and hymnals and missal products for Catholic churches all around the country. And in fact, the world. When I was visiting Singapore, I went into a Catholic church and there was an OCP product in the pew. So that was pretty cool. It's a good place to work.
Didn't you say something had to do with the recent inauguration proceedings?
Yeah. Right after the election, back in November, right? Now President Biden mentioned a hymn in one of his speeches. He said it was a hymn that meant a lot to him and his family, something about raising you up on eagle's wings. And everyone at my company was like, "Oh my gosh, we published that." And that was really exciting. And in subsequent conversations on the news, he and his family members have referred to that song on a few occasions. And so I think Wednesday, my company came out with a new music video for that song. It's called On Eagle's Wings. And it's by Michael Jonkis. And it's somewhere out there on YouTube and Facebook right now. So it's comforting lyrics. It's based on Psalm 90. Anyway, something to be proud of. Yeah.
And I happen to know that one of your colleagues at that publishing house is one of my former students back from the 80s. And I just have wonderful memories of him as a student, and I've kept up with him a bit over the time. So yeah, so musicians do lots of different things, and that's fun to hear about. Sandon, what all do you do when you're not playing with Symphony Tacoma?
Well, I play with other orchestras. I am, in addition to being the assistant principal horn, I am the assistant horn in the Boise Philharmonic in wonderful scenic Boise, Idaho. And I am technically the new fourth horn of the Yakima Symphony. I've been a member of that orchestra for 2 years and have not played a single concert with them due to recent events. And I just, I take auditions, I play with orchestras that will hire me, and I do a lot of driving around the region to get to all those places.
You mentioned the term assistant. Tell us a little bit about the mysterious circumstance of a horn section that has this person called an assistant.
Well, I think an interesting way to understand the need for an assistant, which is like the horn section is the only section that has a standard person who's always generally there in that role. Occasionally in heavy pieces, trumpets will get an assistant for like a single heavy piece, but it's most major orchestras will have 5 horn players for one for each part, and then the assistant as well. And the reason for that is I like to think about To really understand the need for an assistant in the horn section, I think it's interesting to think of a big band trumpet section. And when you play a brass instrument, you have your little mouthpiece, you push it right up against your face, and it kind of makes you pretty tired. So when they're writing for like a jazz trumpet section, they do a very interesting and very good and sensible thing, which is the first trumpet is the one that plays the really high and loud stuff and leads the section. The second trumpet is primarily the solo one, so that the second trumpet is not, tiring themselves out playing loud and high all the time and then having to play the solo. It's very sensible.
Yeah.
They don't really do that in orchestras, and first horn in a major orchestra has to do both of those roles. They have to play high and loud. They have to do all the heavy lifting, but then they have to play the solo. Like Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony, there's tons of just ridiculous high and loud stuff you have to do in that part. And then you have like 16 measures to sit there, and then you have to play one of the longest and most beautiful solos ever written for the horn. And that is unfeasible. So my job is to make it feasible. When there's a bunch of loud and tiring stuff, I sit right next to Dan. I read the exact same part. He puts little brackets on there to tell me when to play, and I take over his role. I lead the section on those parts that are, the tiring parts that are a bit less important.
Yeah.
Because the real special stuff he's going to take, because that's his job. I'm just there to make things a little bit easier for him.
And you do a great job, Sandon. Really.
Thank you.
I'm very lucky to have you in this section. And because Sandon's such an excellent player, I try really hard to still not just give him all just the dregs. I try to give him juicy bits here and there and soloistic things. And also, if I don't give him stuff every once in a while, he's just going to sit there getting colder and colder and colder. And then to come in on something high and loud is not so great on the embouchure, the lip muscles either. So there's some strategy involved. But there are some concerts where I feel badly because I'm like, I'm so sorry. I just don't have a lot to do. And now you don't have a lot to do either. So just watch the conductor and get some tips.
This is great because, as a composer, I'm trained to write 4 horn parts. That's kind of the standard. The horn family, the horn section has 4 parts, and we all write 4-part horn music. And yet the audience is looking at the section saying, but there's 5 people. And so this is what's interesting. And of course, as Sandon pointed out, it comes about because composers like me are constantly asking the impossible of horn players. And so horn players just said, fine, we'll solve the problem our way. And that's just become...
It's not the impossible, it's just the unreasonable.
There you go. Very good. Well, so this brings up an interesting question. Everybody listening has heard the term flutist or flautist, pianist or pianist, right? And there's all this discussion, well, which one is more sophisticated? Which one should we use, right? And we hear the same thing about this instrument that you play. Some people call it the horn. Some people call it the French horn. Why is this a mystery? And what should we call it? And what is the history of this confusion?
I'd like to make a small sort of, not correction, but distinction that the only people who call it French horn are English speakers. No other country calls it a French horn, unless it's sort of like some cultures, like in Spanish now, they'll call it a French horn just because that's what Americans call it. So, but historically, if you're in France or Spain or Denmark or Russia, it's just a horn. But Sandon, you lived in France, so maybe I should let you handle this one.
I did live in France. I wasn't playing the horn at that time, so details of that I wouldn't know. However, when it comes to, I think the reason it's called the French horn is that back in the day, the hunting horn sort of standard that the modern horn is sort of evolved from is mainly had its origins in France. The sort of hunting horn that had no valves that you would, you'd play jolly hunting music that is every final movement of every horn concerto nowadays.
And I think much in the same way that,
No, go ahead.
Yeah, and much in the same way that Italians kind of took over the musical landscape of Europe in the 16 and 1700s. That's why we use allegro and moderato in our music terms now, is they went as far as England and as far as Russia and as far as northern Germany. I think that French horn players went across the English Channel to London, and so they were talking about the excellence of those French horn players. And they really meant horn players from France, and not that the instrument itself was called a French horn. Yeah. Kind of like the English horn, right? It's not technically English, it's cor anglais, which means angled horn due to the vocal. Yeah. But it got mistranslated as English at some point, so now everyone calls it an English horn in English-speaking countries. Everyone else calls it a cor anglais.
Yeah.
Okay. The arcane mysteries of the terminology that we use in the orchestra. Well, let's talk a little bit about the horn then, which is essentially a very long tube that has a conical bore, meaning it's very, very thin up near the mouthpiece and gets quite wide at the other end of it. And it's sort of a constant conical, enlargement from beginning to end. Tell us a little bit, whichever of you would like to, tell us a little bit about all of that tubing that we see in there, and of course those valves that modern horns use.
Well, I think it's interesting that if we hold up both of our horns at the same time, you'll see they look a little bit different. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
1, 2, 3, 4. I've got 4. How many do you have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
6. So, and originally they had 0, right? They had no valves. At some point, let's see. I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves according to the sort of plan that we've got for talking about the development of the instrument. But the way that the horn is coiled, all the tubes up together, is called the wrap of the horn. And horns can be wrapped a couple different ways. There are 2 sort of main schools of wrapping a horn. There's a Geyer style wrap, which I think Sandon has a good example of. And there's a Crosby kind of wrap, which if you've seen the nickel silver horns in many orchestras, they've got that. And that's where we came up with the title for today's show. That's a Wrap, was based on how the horn is coiled. The end of the horn is called the bell, so we were thinking maybe calling the show All the Bells and Whistles or something like that, but we decided on That's a Wrap. But yeah, originally the horns did not have valves and could only play the notes of something called the overtone series, which has been understood as far back as the time of Pythagoras. And I think I said Sandon got a chance to demonstrate this because he's got the really good mic for his horn over in his studio.
And the point there that we all should notice is that his fingers were nowhere near his valves. So he was not using any valves at all to do that. That was just his lips on this length of tubing, which is incredibly impressive, I must say.
Yeah, especially when you realize that the top notes he was playing were essentially a scale. So horn, one of the reasons horn is considered one of the more difficult instruments is you're making those sounds with your mouth and your lips. And if you make a little error, you get the note that's either a step above or a step below. And you can get some pretty embarrassing clinkers. Yeah. So when people
chromatic at the very top.
Yeah. So when people like Bach were writing for horn in the orchestra in the early 1700s, they were writing for an instrument that only had those pitches available. And they usually wrote for pairs of horns. So 2 was the main number of horns in an orchestra for a long time, not 4. Sorry, there we go, 4. And it led to sort of a musical trope or meme, if you want to call it that, called horn fifths. It's because the middle interval is a fifth. And I thought Sandon and I could demonstrate that together. It's going to be over the video call, so there's going to be maybe a slight delay between our two sounds, and I'll try to ameliorate that by pausing, but it's one of the downfalls of modern technology. There's latency is still a thing. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm not going to play with my fingers. Ready? Sandon?
Yeah.
Did that come across okay?
That sort of classic duet, we hear that all over everywhere in classical music, right? You'll hear that in Mozart, you'll hear it in Bach, you'll hear it in Beethoven, you'll hear it in Mahler. I mean, what these things that we call the horn fifths, a kind of a harmony that is available just on tubes of vibrating air with no valves at all. And the reason we hear it all the time is because that's what these instruments could do. Yeah.
It's all over the music for the Royal Fireworks by Handel. It gets used even after horns had valves. People use it as kind of a hallmark or a thumbprint of the horn. And it gets used in Linus and Lucy from Peanuts, if you know that music. It uses horn fifths.
Right.
And also, like, because it's unique to the horn, it has that feeling of being outdoors or maybe off in the distance, far away. And Beethoven uses it in his piano sonata called Les Adieux, which means goodbye, because it represents the people going off in the distance. And that's the first thing you hear in that piano sonata. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. I think we have a couple of excerpts of some of what you're going to play on February 27th queued up. And so maybe I'll ask Susan if she wants to play. The first of these is from one of the pieces by Cherepnin that you will play on the 27th. And you selected it, Dan and Sandon, because it shows off this kind of horn fifth harmony. So let's go ahead and hear that. Yeah, so you heard that harmony. It sounds so familiar. We've all heard that a million times, and it's because of the physics and the acoustics of this instrument. By the way, thanks to Susan, who's running our show tonight, but who also took this kind of behind-the-scenes video that we're watching tonight. It's not the video you'll be watching on the 27th, but it's kind of fun to see this backstage version. Yeah, and then Dan, you also mentioned the kind of the hunting meme that we often associate with horns, because when people were out with their horses and their dogs, they had horn players playing calls, right? And those calls meant things, right? They were almost like signals.
That's exactly right. I think people are familiar with this concept from the military, where the bugle does certain calls for the chow call or reveille or taps. The horns had similar calls for hunting context. So if you're out in the woods, if you did this one call, it means we're really close to the game. Or if you did this other call, it means we're not sure where it is. And so then someone else with their horn and their set of horses in another part of the woods could say, oh, we know where the game is. Come over this way. Mm-hmm. And composers like Bach use this. They just lifted some of these calls outright for pieces, including the Brandenburg First Concerto, if you know that piece. I know Greg does, but maybe our audience. If you don't know it, it's really wonderful.
Yeah.
So Roger Johnson in the Facebook chat said, reminds me of Alp horns, which I think is a very, very interesting point, because an Alp horn is pitched in the key of F, the same as the horn, and it is the exact same length of tubing total. So if we hold the horn and press no valves, that's in the key of F. The exact same length of an Alp horn is cool. Just the exact same thing, just coiled up into a slightly more convenient form factor.
Well, I think we have another excerpt from the same piece by Cherepnin that it illustrates how composers play around with this meme of the hunting call. So, Susan, let's go ahead and hear that one. Okay, so we'll look forward to hearing that whole piece, but definitely that kind of hunting theme or association on display there. So we're talking.
I'd like to point out. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'd like to point out that featured our third and fourth horn player, David and Larry, playing the tune, while Sandon and I just kind of did the rhythmic motive, like that da 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 da. That's all I was doing. It was my part's boring, but Cherepnin does a good job of sort of really showcasing the pairs of horns. So first and second are doing something over here, and then they kind of take it easy, and third and fourth do something over here. So there's kind of a stereophonic effect to the horn quartet that he wrote.
And that's also a very common thing that was done in the music of Brahms and other composers of that similar time, that as they're wanting to make music go, more remote in terms of key areas, well, there's, as we showed with the harmonic series, there's a limited number of notes that you have. But if you have like one set of horns in the key of C, and then you have another set of horns in the key of E, well, now you have a bunch more notes to work with. And so Brahms would do this. The section, there'd be two pairs, a high horn and a low horn. First and second is high and low. Then third and fourth is another pair of high and low horns. But he puts them in a different key, so then there's more notes to work with. And in music like that, you'll have a lot of like solos in the third horn part, just because it has to be there, because that's the person who has the notes that the composer wants.
That's great. And that, of course, leads to the question, which we can't take a lot of time on, but the introduction of valves was kind of a revolutionary thing. People weren't quite sure if they liked it. It was, do you have enough players who can deal with that complexity? And we know that Brahms, for instance, was a real late comer to the game of valved horns and kind of kept writing for valveless horns for a long, long time. But suffice it to say, by the end of the 19th century, virtually every horn player was playing a valved instrument. And by the time you get to Mahler and Strauss, you simply can't function with a natural horn anymore because the music becomes too chromatic. It requires instant access to all of the notes. So that's a fascinating study in and of itself. But let's talk a little bit about you're playing horn quartet music. In other words, this has become, by the end of the 19th century, an ensemble. Instead of just a section of an orchestra or a band, it's now become its own ensemble, and composers are writing music for this. So we have an early piece by Carl Maria von Weber, who is famous for a number of things, but among others wrote sort of the first big, splashy, romantic opera that's a sort of a ghostly fairy tale and has a lot of hunting themes in it. So I don't really know, was this fantasy quartet that you're going to play on the concert, was it originally written for four horns?
Yes, it's an arrangement. It's like a potpourri of Weber's tunes. It starts with the slow introduction, but then has the famous Weber wrote for four horns this really beautiful chorale at the beginning of the overture. And then it has another slow theme from elsewhere in the opera. And then it ends with the Hunter's Chorus, which Weber wrote for horn quartet in like a men's choir, the men's chorus. It's really robust and very exciting. So we thought that would be good because Weber really understood how to write for four horns. And even though I said orchestras had two horns, that was for symphonic concert music. Operas needed a wider array of tone color and dramatic effect. And so the opera orchestra had four horns fairly early on. I think Der Freischütz that you're talking about was written in 1821. So he was still thinking about the horn that was based on the natural horn, although they admitted certain extra notes that you could get with the hand, because once you were off the horse and didn't have to hold on to the reins, you had a hand that was available to help manipulate the pitch. So let's see here. There we go. I can almost get a scale. But you can see that to get it, I have to muffle the sound with my hand. And so that was kind of the intermediate step between just natural horn hunting calls and what they called the Waldhorn in the orchestra, the forest horn, before valves were invented.
Yeah. And the reason that you mentioned there being resistance to switching to valves is because back then there was a different sense of what music should sound like. The horn has an uneven sound when you play with the hand stop, and some of the notes sound dramatically different, and that was celebrated on the instrument, and it was like considered by some players, especially those in France, where like the Paris Conservatory kept teaching natural horn technique like well into the time that natural horns were no longer used pretty much anywhere else. But it was considered a part of the technique, and there's a lot of music written for hand horn that literally has a chromatic note that is the arrival phrase, the arrival point of the phrase, because that note will sound very different. So see if I can play it. Beethoven, when he was so young that a critic at the time of the premiere said, "Who is this Beethoven?" wrote a sonata for horn and piano, and haven't played it for a while. Forgive me if I miss a few things, but you'll probably hear of how literally the point of the phrase is a stop note. Yeah, nice. There's a bunch of music. It ends on that chromatic stop note. That is the most stopped note there.
Yeah.
Because that unevenness of sound is what's celebrated. Roger Johnson asked, why is your hand almost always in the bell? Because historical tradition. That's how you always played it, because you had to do the hand stop technique, and we've never really stopped. It probably makes it sound properly like a horn.
And then Strauss and Mahler, then they go out of their way to write stopped horn sounds, even though it's a chromatic instrument, to get that buzzy quality that became kind of a special effect. Starting around the time of Berlioz, even he used it to great effect when Symphony Tacoma did Symphony Fantastique a couple years ago. The beginning of the March to the Scaffold is for the hand-stopped horns, and it gives it like a really nasal, driving, ominous kind of quality. So composers continued to use this well into the end of the 1800s, even though the valve was patented in 1814, and the first valved horn was patented in 1818. So
yeah, but that first patent's a weird box valve that
it's crazy.
It's like it looks like a cube that goes up and down, as opposed to
it's like a piston valve, like on a trumpet. The kind of the valves that horns are used to seeing, those were patented in the 1830s. Yeah. So, but by the time we get to getting back to Greg's original question about when did the horn quartet become kind of its own thing, partly from operas using four horns and composers utilizing those tone colors. And the horn can go very low and very high, as we heard Sandon play earlier on the instrument. So you really have sort of an SATB texture, a vocal texture from soprano through bass voices. In that way, it's very much like a string quartet. You have low and high. And Haydn wrote an experimental symphony in 1765 for four horns called Mit dem Hornsignal. And I don't know, maybe it didn't make a very good effect because composers didn't put four horns in the orchestra for like another 100 years almost.
But that piece is so good.
It's great. It's fantastic. Beethoven wrote for three horns in the Eroica Symphony of 1805, but didn't write a four-horn symphony until the Ninth Symphony in 1824. But Schumann wrote it's kind of like, sometimes it's hard to tell if it's valved or natural horn, because they still had that idea of the natural horn in their ears. But in 1849, Schumann wrote a concert piece for four horns and orchestra that's just a showpiece for the for the horn quartet. They get to stand out in front of the orchestra and really come to the fore and shine. So probably by like the 1850s, Greg, the horn quartet was an established thing, and people like Schumann and Schubert were writing for horn quartet in like men's choir, or horn quartet on its own. We're going to play a piece by a guy named Frederick Constantine Homelius, not a well-known name, but he was writing for horn quartet in the 1830s and 40s. So,
yeah. Let's go ahead and talk about the last two pieces on your program, which are contemporary pieces. I'm particularly excited by the piece by Gina Gilly, her Horn Quartet number 1, because she's not only a colleague of mine at PLU and a former member of the horn section of Symphony Tacoma, but she's also a former student of mine. And I remember Gina when she was at PLU. She was a formidable musician as a singer, pianist, and hornist. And as if that wasn't scary enough, she went off to graduate school and became a composer as well. So she's now a quadruple threat as a musician, and has been writing a lot of brass music. Because she's a brass player herself, she gets commissions from all over the country. These pieces are premiered at big festivals and symposia for brass. And so she's just constantly writing new music for brass. And so I'm delighted to see that you're doing a piece of hers. And I wonder if one of you would like to tell us a little bit about that piece. And I think we have a short demo from that as well.
Yeah, so it is a wonderful piece. Unfortunately, we only had time to prepare the first movement, but it is a 3-movement work for horn quartet. It was inspired by the Hindemith Sonata for 4 horns, which is another incredible work for the horn quartet. And I kind of feel like that is a piece that in some way defines the ensemble for everything that comes past it, in a very similar way to the famous Brahms horn trio that he wrote back in the day, where Johannes Brahms apparently was a horn player when he was young and decided to write a piano trio, but then instead of doing it normally with a piano, violin, and cello, he decided to replace the cello with a horn and wrote that piece. And every single piece that has been written for that instrumentation afterwards is in some way inspired by or reacting to the Brahms trio. And well, even ones where they also substitute the violin out for something else are also inspired by the Brahms trio, which the Hindemith Sonata works in a very similar way. And there's this tune in the final movement, which is a German song called I Sound My Horn from long ago, where for the final movement, Hindemith wrote a bunch of variations on that. And a lot of people writing for horn, especially horn quartet, do the exact same thing. Take that tune, write variations on it, and that is exactly what Gina did. And when you get to the concert, she will explain it much more in detail, but it's a piece that is inspired by that Hindemith quartet and ends the final movement with a set of variations of that exact same tune. It's a wonderful piece. I am so happy to have been able to play it.
It's great. And in keeping with this kind of trajectory of tonight's conversation, where we talked about the natural horn and then hand horn techniques and eventual addition of valves, you'll see in the last 2 pieces, the Carrie Turner fanfare and the Gina Gilly horn quartet, they are not treating the horn as a sort of limited scope instrument. It's a nimble, facile instrument. You'll hear these cascading sextuplets, 6-note groups, really, really fast finger work for the horns. And the clip that we're going to show starts with me with the solo, and then Sandon has the second statement, so it features both of us. And you'll see it's really nimble, and then the key shifts are very sudden. And so it's just not something that would have been achievable on a natural horn, but it sounds great on a modern instrument.
Yeah. Okay, Susan, let's go ahead and hear that clip from Gina Gilly's Horn Quartet number 1. And I think I heard a little of that stop sound in there too, didn't I? On some sort of accented notes.
It wasn't stopped, but it's what we call brassy or cuivre, and that's it gives it that kind of sizzly edge, and that's you get there when you get up to like a fortissimo sound. So it's part of the different parts of the palette, the tone color palette.
In my experience, it's only the French that say cuivre.
Right.
Everyone else,
Sorry.
I just assume that it's implied when they tell you to play loud. The French are the only ones that will go, no, I don't want you brassy until now.
Right. Some people write brassy in English language scores, like band music and stuff like that. You'll see the word brassy. Yeah. I call it sizzle. I like it when it's got that little edge.
Good. Well, we'll have better sound quality on the 27th, but I hope the audience could hear that those sextuplets going by. You know, that is just so fun to hear this instrument that's been associated with hunting horn calls suddenly just take off and just become this agile bird flying around. It's glorious.
Yeah, that looks like the right spelling in the chat now.
Aha. Yeah. Well, let me just ask the audience directly if anybody has any further questions based on what we have talked about so far. Anything from physics and acoustics to the life of a horn player to any of the repertoire. I saw one person asked earlier something about Sandon, how high can you play?
So the note that I went up to was horn speak and transposing pitch. So we would call it a C, but it's an F in real pitch. And that is the note that I went up to is the highest note that is generally standard in orchestral writing. Now, I can go a little bit higher. I think my record is a G above that, so a perfect fifth, perfect fifth above that. However, it gets unreliable for me above that. So on my best day, I was able to get a fifth above that. But that note that I played, the highest one, is in standard orchestral writing. That's the highest you're ever going to see. That's the note that ends the very famous Siegfried horn call, which is
right.
It's a difficult one.
However,
very interesting thing in the Gilly, the very end, Dan Partridge plays a half step higher than that. So look forward to that in the show.
I guess as a composer, Gina can claim to get away with that because she's a horn player. Somebody's asking, Sandon, what kind of horn do you play?
This horn is a Hans Hoyer horn. It is a German model of horn. And yeah, it's the Model 802, which is the cheapest horn that they make, which is also better than the one that is basically this, but more expensive. I don't understand it.
There's also a great question if horns are used in any other music genres the way trumpets are. Now, my mind immediately goes to late 1940s Miles Davis, but you guys probably know more than I do about that.
That's exactly where I went. Birth of the Cool, that album, Gil Evans wrote for horns. Stan Kenton's big bands often used mellophoniums, which are like kind of related to the horn. The
worst instrument ever.
They're terrible. But somehow the jazz guys make them sound okay, probably because wrong notes are allowed in jazz, right? So there's that. There are a couple really great rock songs that use horns.
I think John Entwistle of The Who was a horn player, wasn't he?
That's right.
Tommy, you know, the old rock opera Tommy, you can hear horn.
Also, there's that song, "You Can't Always Get What You Want, but if you try sometimes, you might find you get what you need." That song begins with a great horn solo. And there are a couple horn solos on the Beatles tracks that you wouldn't necessarily recognize because they were using tape to record stuff, and they would record it on horn and then speed up the tape to twice the speed, and it would sound more like a trumpet or a flugelhorn, but it's actually a French horn. So that gets used sometimes in rock music. In fact, on New Year's Eve, just a couple weeks ago, I went down to one of the recording studios in Portland and recorded for a kind of a metal album, like a heavy metal kind of band. It was the band had broken up and the lead singer was doing her own solo project, and I got to go in and record some horn tracks for that. So that was really exciting. And of course, film scores, right? Film scores have lots of stuff for horn.
Lots of horns and film scores.
You mentioned the famous opening of Star Wars theme. Have you played that?
Yeah. Star Wars is one of those films that has a great soundtrack, and they make concerts out of it where they took the film, they removed the soundtrack, and they gave everyone a set of parts. And you go to the show, they project the film on the screen, and you provide the soundtrack. And so I have played A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back in Boise.
Yeah.
Both of them, and that's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I had the privilege just before the COVID pandemic of subbing with the Oregon Symphony for one of their movie music concerts, and they weren't projecting the film, but it was all John Williams music. So we played stuff from E.T. and Star Wars and Indiana Jones, Schindler's List. It was fantastic. I mean, the guy knows how to write for instruments, not just the horn. He has a real ear for the idiomatic sound of an instrument. So super satisfying to play.
Well, I have a dissertation topic for anybody out there listening who's looking for a dissertation topic, and that's the use of horn in hip-hop beats. I'm sure there's a condition there. We just don't know what it is yet. So somebody can go figure that out. Listen, we're about out of time, but I just want to thank both Daniel and Sandon for joining me tonight to this talk about the fascinating world of the horn quartet. And of course, they'll be joined by their colleagues, David McBride and Larry Vevig, on third and fourth horn for that concert. The broadcast, again, just to remind you, is February 27th at 7:30 p.m. So make sure you mark that on your calendar, and you'll hear the full-blown produced sound and video from Symphony Tacoma. Let me just once again thank our sponsors who make all of this possible for us: Multicare, Tacoma Creates, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Washington State Arts Commission, the League of American Orchestras, and locally back here in Tacoma, again, One Step Dentistry and Charles Wright Academy. Thank you once again to all of those people. And thank you for joining in. It's been just absolutely wonderful watching your comments go by. And we hope we'll see you all on February 27th. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And thanks, Dan and Sandon. Bye-bye, everybody.